With us today, as usual, our CWNE number 183, our Chief Wireless Officer, Mr. Jim Vajda, and Heather Dremel, our Digital Marketing Manager. Jim, the floor is yours.
Good to be here. Thanks, Don, and thanks, Heather. So real quick about me. I'm the Chief Wireless Officer here at 7Signal, and I'm a CWNE. And right now I'm working on renewing my Cisco CCNP Enterprise, but I'm a wireless network engineer. I've been doing this for around 10 years now. So let's talk about Wi-Fi contention, 802.11 contention. A little background on what we're even talking about today. So contention is a method for sharing channel access using a standardized protocol that is used by all the clients and APs operating on the same channel. And this concept, this idea, I think of as really being the heart and soul of Wi-Fi. And I say that because it's really connected to everything else we're doing in Wi-Fi, even when we're not thinking about clear channel assessments and nav timers and contention windows and things like that. A lot of what we're doing is affecting the contention process. And when we're improving wireless designs, we are improving the likelihood that a client will win contention and be able to transmit because the channel is idle more often than it's busy. And we're improving the likelihood that client's transmissions will be acknowledged by the receiver. There'll be fewer collisions. And so we're working on improving the efficiency of that process. But a really important concept that's core to Wi-Fi. And so the protocol we use in Wi-Fi to handle contention is the Enhanced Distributed Coordination Access Protocol, EDCA, sometimes pronounced EDCA. And what it ensures is that each station acting individually, and a station is an access point or a client. We're thinking about them kind of like being equals, just sharing the same channel. Each station has to, on its own, individually, make sure the channel is free before it transmits. And so it checks the channel to see if it's free, and we'll call that being idle, or if it's something else is going on in the channel, someone else is transmitting, or there's interference. In that case, the channel's busy and the station won't transmit. It's a listen before talk protocol. We're operating an unlicensed spectrum. We have no idea what channel conditions are. There's other protocols operating in the channel. There's other APs that we were unaware of, other stations using the channel. And so we have to check and make sure it's available before we transmit. This is a carrier sense with multiple access and collision avoidance protocol, as opposed to the same thing with collision detection that we can do in wired protocols. And it defines the modern 802.11 contention process. The amendment that we got EDCA from was 802.11e in 2005, which enhanced the distributed coordination function we already had from the early days of Wi-Fi by adding QoS queues to it. But the most important concept about this is that every station's acting individually. It's uncoordinated. It looks like there's order and orchestration going on the channel, but really it's an emergent order from individual stations acting alone, using the same rules for channel access, and then, in the best case scenario, politely sharing the channel with each other when they need to transmit. So there's a lot of steps in the EDCA arbitration process. The first one is that layer 1 check, that PHY layer check, the clear channel assessment. And that's what we're going to focus on today. If you want to learn about the rest of these, we did an earlier webinar on the basics of 802.11 arbitration, where we go deeper on the nav, timer, interframe spacing, the contention window, and everything else. But today, our focus is on the clear channel assessment. And there are two components of the clear channel assessment. We have signal detect, and signal detect is really where we're listening for any 802.11 frame that we can demodulate. Don't let signal detect fool you. It's really, sometimes this is called preamble detect, because we're not just listening for any signal in an sort of radio sense of the word. We're listening for an 802.11 transmission. So that's what we're talking about when we say signal detect. So that's why preamble detect is a more accurate term, but the standard says signal detect more often. So that's what I'm going to go with. And there's a little bit of confusion about what the real signal detect thresholds are. The standard says for the OFDM PHYs, which is basically everything except 802.11b, that the threshold for signal detect is minus 82 dBm. But really that's a minimum, and most 802.11 radios will trip their signal detect threshold at much, much lower signal strengths. And so a better rule of thumb for that is 4 dB of SNR. So if a frame is 4 dB, a transmission is 4 dB above the noise floor, it's probably going to trip the signal detect threshold for most Wi-Fi stations. And important point here too is that there's a lot of diversity in the quality of Wi-Fi stations, and some have more sensitive radios than others. And so you could have signals that trip the signal detect threshold for some clients, but not others. And we also use this to set a phi layer timer using the length field that we can hear in the preamble. I think we combine that with the rate field to understand the length of the current frame and how long we need to wait before it's finished. But one myth in Wi-Fi is that if a neighboring AP is operating on the channel I'm operating on, if it's really loud, that's so much worse than if it's quieter. But in reality, it doesn't matter how loud it is. If we're demodulating the frames, then we're going to back off, and the CCI is just as bad whether it's at neg 80 or neg 50. The contention process is going to make us back off and wait, regardless of the signal strength of those frames, at least on the primary channel. And we'll get more into what happens in wide channels as we go. The next part of the clear channel assessment is called energy detect. And this is where the station is listening for any RF energy on the channel. And this is a far less sensitive threshold. 20 dB above the signal detect threshold is where it's needs to be. So if we're doing signal detect at minus 90, then our energy detect is going to be at minus 70. So far less sensitive there. But this is where we're listening for non-802.11 signals, if you will. So Bluetooth or interference sources like microwaves or anything else operating on the spectrum. And I will make a trap that you shouldn't fall into is looking at the noise value an adapter shows you and thinking that that's going to be related to our energy detect CCA check. They're actually distinct things. And 802.11 radios are really bad at detecting noise. They often give you very sort of misleading figures, and they can miss sources of non-Wi-Fi interference that might be tripping energy detect. So in general, it's a good idea not to trust those values. So that's the CCA process. What we want to know really is what's different with wide channels, right? That's what we want to talk about. And why do we care about what happens in wide channels? Well, one design approach is that if the spectrum's available, you should use it. Use wide channels until you can't is one approach. And certainly with 6 gigahertz coming along, using 80 megahertz wide channels is going to be very common. So we need to understand that each PHY handles CCA and wide channels differently. And each channel width within a PHY has its own rules for CCA. 802.11ac added a new feature called dynamic bandwidth operation, which is an optional enhancement that we'll talk about. And then 802.11ax just turns it up to 11. And not just on the MCS chart. I mean, when it comes to channel access, 802.11ax has really kind of cranked things up and added a lot of complexity here. I'd actually like to do a talk at WLPC next year, specifically on 802.11ax channel access. So hoping that conference goes forward and I get selected there. But we'll talk about that at least in passing. But again, why use wide channels? Well, if we don't have a lot of APs and they're spread out far enough in the 5 gigahertz band, assuming we can use all 25 channels available in the US, we could use 40 megahertz channel widths and have 12 non-overlapping channels to use. And when we look at 6 gigahertz, I mean, it's going to be extremely rare for anyone to use 20 megahertz channels. Maybe in stadiums and things like that, they'll use them. But in a lot of enterprises, since 6 gigahertz, 80 megahertz is going to be very commonly used. So we need to know what we're doing in terms of the CCA and channel access with these wide channels that are becoming more and more in use. So let's look at, plain old everyday 20 megahertz CCA in the OFDM PHYs. So, it's pretty straightforward, like we talked about. We've got an AP operating on channel 36, and it does its CCA looking for signal detect at 4 dB above the noise floor, energy detect 20 dB above that. If both of those pass, so we call the channel idle, we transmit our PPDU. That's just a fancy way of talking about a data frame. It's a physical layer, protocol data unit. And then we get our ACK back when it's received. Everybody's familiar with this, and the other parts of EDCA happen as well, but today we're really focused on CCA. So let's kind of rewind the tape to when we first got wide channels, and that was with 802.11n. And the very first draft of 802.11n, which some devices were built against, gave us 40 megahertz wide operation. But what it didn't give us was any clear channel assessment at all in our secondary channel. So here you see an AP operating on channel 36. It wants to transmit a 40 megahertz wide frame. And to do that, it just checks its primary 20 megahertz channel using the existing CCA rules. And if that's clear, it just transmits. So this is really bad, because imagine we have another access point operating on channel 40. That means the AP we're looking at here is just going to step all over that other access point's transmissions. It's not going to listen before talk like we discussed before. It's just going to transmit. And if there's an AP on channel 40, it'll transmit on top of it. And if that AP on channel 40 is trying to transmit, it's listening before it talks, it's going to keep hearing the AP on channel 36 and not win the channel as often as it should. So really, really bad scenario. And, you know, draft 1.0, that was like 2007 or so. Most of that gear should be out in the landfill by now. But if it's not, you know, if you've got some of this stuff on your network, beware. So, you know, the IEEE realized this was an issue before they finished the 802.11n amendment, and they put a Band-Aid on it. They gave us energy detect only in our secondary channel, and they specified a minimum threshold of -62 dBm. So at least we're checking the secondary channel, but -62 is not very sensitive at all. There's a lot of potential for CCI to be occurring in that secondary channel that this threshold is simply going to miss. And so, you know, imperfect scenario, and man, this is really bad, particularly in the 2.4 gigahertz band. So in 2.4 gigahertz, if we're operating at 40 megahertz wide with 802.11n, we don't have enough space to create another, for another AP to operate that's not going to overlap with the first AP. And the second problem with that, we understand the spectrum limitation, but the second problem is our CCA in the secondary channel is so insensitive that the 40 megahertz wide AP is probably just going to step all over the other one. And so, you know, the IEEE recognized that this was a problem that, and had enough concern about this issue that that's why they decided that 802.11ac would not run in the 2.4 gigahertz band. They had enough concern about the issues around standardizing wide channel access that came about with 802.11n, that they didn't allow 802.11ac to operate in the 2.4 gigahertz band. So let's go to 802.11ac and look at what we have now. So again, our primary channel for 40 megahertz wide operation has the same CCA thresholds that we had before. But now in the secondary channel, we add a signal detect check with a threshold of -72 dBm, you know, as a minimum. So this is cool. We're doing signal detect now in the secondary channel. The threshold isn't very sensitive though, and it's an interesting question to see what the real world thresholds actually are of the chipsets on the market. That'd be interesting to try and test and determine if it's near -72 or if it's much more sensitive like it is in the primary channel. So, you know, we got a little Band-Aid at least that improves, you know, gives us 10 dB more of margin that we're checking with signal detect now versus only doing energy detect. And in 802.11ac, this is we're calling this static bandwidth operation, which will contrast with dynamic bandwidth operation. But in order for us to transmit in the 40 megahertz wide channel, and this is the same with 802.11 too, both of our clear channel assessments have to show the channels as idle. If either one is busy, we back off and we don't transmit. So we need the full 40 megahertz to be idle for us to transmit this 40 megahertz wide data frame. So let's move on to 80 megahertz static bandwidth operation. And you can see here, we've added a third CCA check, this time with a signal detect threshold at -72 dBm and an energy detect threshold at -59 dBm. So our energy detect is 3 dB less sensitive, and our signal detect threshold is about the same. But now we have to check with static bandwidth operation the full 80 megahertz, and it all has to be idle before we transmit. And then we send this big, massive, wide, 80 megahertz wide data frame, get this tiny little 20 megahertz wide acknowledgement back. In fact, just a little aside, all of our control and management traffic just uses that primary 20 megahertz wide channel. So that primary channel is really, really critical because, you know, again, management and control traffic is only 20 megahertz wide. 160 megahertz wide channels also came about with 802.11ac, although it won't be until I think Wi-Fi 6E catches on that we really see this in use at all in the enterprise. And here we get a fourth CCA check on that secondary 80 megahertz wide channel necessary to give us to give us a full 160 megahertz to work with. And again, with static bandwidth operation, the full 160 megahertz has to be idle from our CCA check to transmit it at all. So now we're kind of running the risk with a channel this wide that we could be blocked in some of these sub-channels, secondary channels rather, from transmitting at all our wide data frames. Something to be aware of there. Okay, let's look at 802.11ax, and the basics of the CCA are the same as 802.11ac with static bandwidth operation. Same thresholds in the secondary channels for 40, same thresholds for 80, and the same thresholds for 60. But the trick that 802.11 and 802.11ax are also capable of is what's called dynamic bandwidth operation. And here's an example of what it can do in 80 megahertz in an 80 megahertz wide channel. What can happen in 802.11ac or AX is if, as we go through our CCA checks, we find that the primary channel is idle, we can use the primary in any combination, or rather, any established channel width above that, so 20, 40, 80, or 160, that's idle as well. So in this case, we did CCA in the primary and first secondary channel and found it idle, but our CCA on channels 44 and 48 found it busy. Well, it would kind of be a waste if we didn't transmit anything with the primary channel available. So what dynamic bandwidth operation lets us do is say, well, that's okay. Let's do RTS, CTS, that's required as well, just to confirm, but then let's just transmit in a 40 megahertz, send a 40 megahertz wide PPDU instead of 80, right? We know some spectrum's available. We know our stations support the 40 megahertz channel width, so let's just use that. It sounds nice. There's some challenges here. One is dynamic bandwidth operation is optional, and to the best of my knowledge is not widely implemented. The second issue is that it depends on the secondary CCA to be tripped. Otherwise, and those thresholds out there are insensitive. Remember, our signal detect is only neg 72 dBm out there. So we might go through this check and find everything's idle according to CCA, send RTS frames in those secondary channels and cause a collision with an overlapping AP that we didn't detect in CCA. So that's better than transmitting a data frame that collides with a data frame. Now we're transmitting an RTS frame that collides with a data frame. Still not that great of a scenario, but it is an improvement when it's available. So I've been talking a lot about, if the secondaries channel is busy, we'll fall back to a smaller channel width. I've been talking a lot about overlapping APs. in IEEE speak, this is OBSS, or overlapping BSSs. And you know, there's a lot of different ways for OBSS to occur with wide channels. And I'm going to talk through some of these scenarios. You know, OBSS is just two APs sharing the same channels. That's all it is. And of course, all their clients do as well. But in the worst case scenario, with an 80 megahertz wide channel, you've got non-overlapping primary channels. And that's a little counterintuitive. You might think, oh, well, my primaries are super busy. I don't want to overlap them. But the reason it's the worst case scenario is if we take the perspective of AP2, its primary channel is 36, and it's using its most sensitive CCA thresholds. Well, AP1 is using its least sensitive CCA thresholds on channel 36. So AP1, particularly if AP2 is below that signal detect threshold for it, it's just going to transmit away. And we're going to have collisions because it's going to transmit on top of AP2 if AP2 has already begun a transmission. And AP2 is going to be is not going to be able to win the channel as often as it should because its signal detect threshold is so much more sensitive. It's going to hear that overlapping transmission and back off. So AP1 is going to be really aggressive and AP2 is going to be really conservative, and that's really going to harm AP2's chances of transmitting. Furthermore, whether we're using dynamic bandwidth operation or not, the primary channel, the primary 20 megahertz channel always has to be idle for us to transmit. So if it's blocked, if it's deemed busy in CCA, nothing can happen. And actually, AP1, or I should say AP2 is doing the same thing to AP1 on channel 48. When it transmits, it's stepping all over AP1's primary channel as well. So we have a lot of collisions where, you know, the APs are rarely winning contention on their primary channels. You know, we've got RTS, CTS overhead, which can help, but can also lead to collisions. This is really, really bad. And testing has shown that this is, you know, going to result in the overall worst performance possible with OBSS. So, like we said, you know, lining up the least sensitive CCA of one AP with the most sensitive CCA on the primary channel of another is just a recipe for bad performance. If we have to have OBSS with wide channels, and I don't think we do, but if we're going to do that, we're better off lining up our primary channels. Again, kind of sounds counterintuitive, but this gives us the best chance of each AP and their clients having a fair and equal opportunity to win the channel more often. It also means, you know, we're backing off and not transmitting on top of each other as often, which leads to fewer collisions. Now, the problem here is that we have a single contention domain. We just have one big line that all the stations have to get into, regardless of which AP they're connected to before they transmit. Because we're contending for the channel, right? We're contending for channel access, not contending for access to an access point. We're contending for access to the channel. So, you know, what's the right thing to do? The right thing to do is just not encounter OBSS at all. Let's just change our channel width down to 40 megahertz. And then, you know, we've got two contention domains, and contention can happen simultaneously in each domain. There's a trade-off here. We give up the highest single client theoretical performance. So we cut the highest available data rate in half when we reduce our channel width by half. But the overall system performance is much, much improved because now we've got contention happening in parallel rather than all at once within a single domain. So to use the sports analogy, if you're going to a football game with 100,000 people in the crowd and there's only one line for concessions, it's going to be really slow. If you add another line, now it's twice as fast. In fact, it's more than twice as fast. Not just because your wait time is cut in half by having fewer people in front of you, but also because there's a cashier at the front of each line that's working in parallel at the same time, rather than just having one that can only do a single transaction at once. So this is what we should do. And regardless of whether DBO is working or not, we can still have collisions, and we're still better off doing this. We have, the PHYs have added more and more sort of band-aids over OBSS with wide channels, and that's great, but it still doesn't match the performance of not having any OBSS at all. For the reasons we talked about. So I mentioned 802.11ax really having some unique new stuff in it. One of those features is OFDMA. This is something totally new to Wi-Fi, at least real world Wi-Fi. This is where the access point takes over and schedules all the channel access that happens, just like a cellular tower would. It orchestrates who transmits when, and in what subchannels, and it's all controlled and coordinated. So that's very different, right, from our distributed access method, EDCA. But the important thing to understand about OFDMA is it happens within EDCA. In other words, the access point that's going to act as the air traffic controller on the channel when OFDMA happens, that access point has to win the channel first through our everyday EDCA process that we've had for 20 years now. So, OFDMA is, EDCA is just as relevant as it's always been. Okay, and then 3 new features that affect channel access that really just crank up the complexity. First is preamble puncturing. This is an optional feature. Doesn't sound like it's going to get much adoption with 802.11ax, but the next major PHY, 802.11be, which will be Wi-Fi 7, it might be, it sounds like that it might be more implemented with that PHY. But you probably noticed the issue with DBO is like, why can't we just figure out what 20 megahertz channels are available and use any combination of them? Not just a 20, 40, 80, or 160 starting at the primary, but the primary plus whatever other 20 megahertz channels we can use in any combination, and that's what preamble puncturing does. Again, optional, and we're not seeing that implemented yet. Spatial reuse CCA thresholds for OBSS frames. So spatial reuse is what gives BSS coloring some value. It's what allows you to set a new CCA threshold that is only applied to OBSS frames. So sometimes, CCA is too sensitive, and we would rather transmit on top of an OBSS frame. If we're only giving up a few dB of SNR because of that OBSS frame, wouldn't we rather just shift down from MCS 11 to MCS 9 and transmit anyway? I think we would, and that's the promise of spatial reuse. again, unfortunately an optional feature in 802.11ax, but we have seen some AP vendors begin to start implementing that. And then dual nav timers, the nav is a MAC layer function, something I didn't talk about today. But we have a second nav timer, this one again targeted at OBSS frames as well. And actually, I wrote a blog post a few months ago on 7signal.com called Sorting Out BSS Coloring, Spatial Reuse, and Dual Nav, if you want to go deeper on those. So let's summarize what we learned about CCA. With 802.11n, at least the ratified version, in the secondary channels, we've got energy detect. 802.11ac brought in signal detect and the option for dynamic bandwidth operation. And then 802.11ax brings in, builds on AC and adds those spatial reuse CCA thresholds that hopefully we'll be able to make use of, particularly in areas where OBSS conditions CCI is unavoidable. That can be a really beneficial feature. And so, what are some takeaways? First, it's a complex situation. A station's phi and channel width changes, even within a single association. Well, shouldn't say that, but while it's connected, if it's roaming between bands, with 802.11ac APs, you're going to 802.11n in the 2.4 gigahertz band, and then back to 802.11ac in the 5 gigahertz band. Some clients, particularly using those widest channel widths, when they rate shift down, they will shift the channel width they're operating at. They'll go from 80 down to 40 to try to reclaim a little SNR and have a little bit better luck, at the bottom end of the MCS range. And on a busy network, it's very likely you'll have many PHYs operating on the channel at once, each according to the rules of the CCA rules that are specified for its PHY. So it's complicated, but despite OBSS getting a little better with each new PHY, right? We get signal detect with 802.11ac, you get DBO as an option, spatial reuse eventually with 802.11ax. Those marginally are improving OBSS, but from a broader perspective, no OBSS is so much better. Even when we give up a little bit of that top end performance to go to a smaller channel width in terms of overall system performance. And so the biggest takeaway, right? What does this mean for me? What should I do? Only use wide channels when you're sure the secondary channels are free. We've got a lot of new technology, a lot of new techniques for dealing with OBSS, but you're better off just not dealing with it at all if you can avoid it, for the reasons I specified earlier. So, okay, I think with that, we're right at time, but maybe we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Great job. Great presentation. A lot of great feedback in here. Folks loving the webinars. This one in particular, of course. A lot of questions here. And before I get to the questions, just a couple shout outs from folks that I didn't get a chance to say hello to. We got Kirk from Germany, welcome back. David in Idaho saying hello as well, and Germond in Norway saying it's very raining there. We've got a Boo back from South Africa, Bavesh in Chicago, and many, many more. Thanks for letting us know where you guys are all logging in from. And hopefully that gave you a couple more minutes to put some questions in chat here. So I'm going to start with Lawrence, who says, good morning. In reference to signal detect, would Zigbee be a problem in noise detection in 802.11? Yeah, so Zigbee
because it's not 802.11 itself, would not trip signal detect. We would require, we would use the clear channel assessment energy detect process to detect Zigbee.
Thank you. Bhavesh wants to know, so does this mean that the wider the channel, the more you should use auto detect, and the narrower the channel, the more likely you can choose what channels to use specifically?
I actually think actually think the opposite is true. I think the wider the channel, the more careful you have to be that those channels are available and not overlapping with your own APs and the APs of your neighbors.
Thank you, Jim. From Don, is there a way to detect dynamic versus static by observing the frame?
You know, I've looked into that, Don. That's a good question. And it looks like the field where that is indicated is in the preamble, and even with radio tap headers, we're not capable of seeing that. However, I mean, you could do, if you did like a 4-channel packet capture across an 80 megahertz channel, you could see the, you know, the concurrent RTS, CTS frames, and you could observe an AP just switching channel widths, for instance, by, you know, adding another AP on that secondary 40, for example. So you could lab up a really elaborate test of that to see if it's happening.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for the question, Don. Barry wants to know if you can't use Uni2 channels because of certain devices, would you use 40 megahertz channels in dense environments?
Yeah, good question, Barry. I'm of the opinion that you should stick with 20 megahertz channels until you don't need them, or until they don't meet your requirements. So I would say, well, particularly there, when you've only got 8 or 9 channels, definitely use 20 megahertz channel widths in a dense environment, because you're going to have CCI even with 20 megahertz channels. But I'd also say, you know, my school of thought is the performance we can get from 20 megahertz is more than enough for most enterprise use cases. And if we don't actually use every channel in our channel plan, that leaves a few channels available for other users to come and turn on their hotspots, and neighboring APs and networks maybe will use those channels. You know, we're kind of depending on auto channel selection algorithms for sorting that out, unfortunately, but it gives us a possibility of avoiding OBSS.
Mm-hmm. I'll keep going here, rapid fire, Jim, as long as you can keep up.
I'm good.
All right, let's do it. Sandeep wants to know, what is the primary reason for low thresholds in secondary channels by spec?
That's a very good question, Sandeep. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
Oh, we should send him some merch, Heather. Sandeep, we got to get him something. He stumped our.
He stumped me. Yeah, I think that should get him something.
Let's see here. Anusha, how does dynamic channel allocation happen when dynamic bandwidth happen with dynamic bandwidth allocation? I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Does that make sense to you? How does dynamic channel allocation happen with dynamic bandwidth allocation?
Yeah, so 2 different processes. So dynamic channel allocation, I think we're talking about RRM here. So this is the overall automatic planning of our channel plan, including channel widths. And dynamic bandwidth operation is different. So our overall channel plan should be, you know, to use non-overlapping channels as much as possible, and use, you know, this, you know, only go into wide channel widths if we can do that without creating overlap. And that's kind of like that sets the overall normal performance of the APs. Dynamic bandwidth operation actually happens on a frame by frame level. So every data frame has this check before it to see how much spectrum's available, and then we use the full 80 or only 40 or only 20, and that changes every frame as every frame is transmitted. So it's much more fine-grained and responsive to changes in available spectrum.
Thanks, Jim. We'll do one or two more, though there's probably another 10 in here, and we can certainly address those offline as well. But from Glenn, does the client Wi-Fi chipset a factor for OBSS to work?
Does the client Wi-Fi chip for? I think he's talking about 802.11ax.
Well, we'll skip that one because just in the interest.
If we're talking about spatial reuse, yes, absolutely. The clients and APs all have to support that feature for it to work.
All right, so we'll do just one more here, and we'll take the other ones offline. Thanks everyone for the questions. John, on a 2.4 gigahertz network where channels are not aligned, will these be subject to signal detection thresholds or energy detection thresholds? Example, channels 1 and 3 particularly overlapping.
Yeah, good question. So that's called adjacent channel interference, and the reason why it's so much worse for performance than co-channel interference is because we're not tripping signal detect with partially overlapping channels. We're tripping energy detect if we're lucky, because that's, again, is a less sensitive threshold. We're more likely just to transmit on top of each other and have collisions, whereas if both APs were on channel 1, we're more likely to trip signal detect, and APs take turns accessing the channel without those collisions.
All right, excellent. Let's see. So that we'll take the rest of the questions offline. Jim, thank you very much for presenting today. Great questions, everyone. We had a great topic, hot topic for everybody. It seemed excellent, gigantic crowd today. Have a great week, everyone. We will see you all next week. And the topic will be with Mr. Badman is back. We've got Lee Badman back. Just how fragmented is the Wi-Fi client space? So great topic for you all next week as well. And we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.